The wind shrieks across the fjord, like a hungry wolf, flinging snow in ragged spirals that dance between pine trunks and over frozen pasture. Beneath this steel-grey sky, a boy trudges through knee-deep drifts. He is perhaps 12 winters old, no older than a modern schoolboy, but the look in his eyes is not that of a child. His name is Erling, son of a free farmer, born in the low coastal hills near Trondheim. His tunic is rough-woven wool, patched with scraps of deerskin. Fur boots, stiff with frost, crunch over the ice-bound earth. A sheepskin cloak hangs from his shoulders, but snow clings to it, and the cold gnaws at the bare skin of his cheeks and hands. In his left hand, he grips a crooked staff of pine. In his right, a rope, knotted and frayed from many seasons of use. The rope runs behind him, tied around the horns of 2 shaggy sheep that fight the wind with hunched shoulders and stamping hooves, their breath plumes white in the dusk. Erling's father and elder brother are out at sea, gone since before dawn, in a low, clinker-built boat, netting cod beneath the drifting ice. His mother and sister wait at home, tending the fire that keeps the small longhouse alive through the endless dark. If the sheep stray or fall, the family will lose more than wool, and meat they will lose warmth, milk, the living pulse that binds them to spring's promise. So the boy pulls, one step at a time, ignoring the bite of wind on his ears, the frozen burn at the tips of his fingers. A modern child, we might say, should be inside, safe by the hearth, warm and dry. But in Erling's world, there is no soft shelter from nature's demands. To be warm means to earn warmth, to fetch it, herd it, guard it, with young bones that already bear the weight of survival. In the distance, a ridge of black fir trees shields the valley floor. Beyond it, smoke rises thin and grey, the promise of home. He speaks to the sheep in a low voice, half command, half prayer to the gods of the snow. His words are lost to the wind, but the beasts move on, driven by trust and hunger both. As he climbs the final slope, dusk deepens into a bluish gloom. Somewhere above, the northern sky stirs with ghost light the first hints of green and silver that ripple like breath along the heavens. In the boy's mind flicker the old stories. How Odin won, rides through such storms, his wolves snarling at the edge of mortal sight. How Thor's hammer strikes far mountains, shattering ice and driving winter's bite deeper into men's flesh. A reminder that even gods love the hard and the strong. Erling does not fear the blizzard. He fears only failure to let the sheep die, to come home empty-handed. For a Viking child, there is no softer lesson than this. The world cares nothing for your tears. It is the frozen wind that carves a man from a boy, and only those carved by hardship will ever lift sword or oar in their father's place. When at last he crests the ridge, breath burning in his lungs, he sees the longhouse door thrown open. A yellow lantern flickers in the snow-drifted yard. His sister's voice carries through the storm, a single cry, half scolding, half relief. The sheep shuffle forward, shaking ice from their wool. Erling's numb hand tightens on the rope, and he smiles through cracked lips. He will sleep tonight by the hearth, warmth earned by his own hands. A boy in a blizzard, just a boy. But the same boy, a decade later, will stand shield to shield on a Saxon shore, iron in hand, wind still at his back. And men trained in barracks, fed on rations, hardened in modern wars, would they match the child who conquered cold, hunger and fear before his voice even broke? In the north, a Viking child learned early, the world is no cradle, it is an anvil, and you are what the hammer shapes you to be. Long before a Viking child lifted a wooden sword or carved his father's runes into the ribs of a driftwood log, He was shaped by a mother far more merciless than any mortal parent, the land itself. Scandinavia, the cradle of the Norse, was no easy garden. It was a realm of narrow fjords hemmed by granite cliffs, forests so dense they swallowed light, and winters that stretched their claws deep into spring. Where modern children learn to fear a schoolyard bully or a scraped knee, Norse children learned to fear the quiet hunger that crept through the longhouse when grain bins ran low, the thin cries of livestock caught in a sudden snow squall, the icy breath that slipped beneath furs at night. Picture it, a coastal farmstead on the southern edge of Norway. The soil is thin and stingy, scattered with stones older than any saga. To coax life from such earth, entire families laboured side by side, fathers breaking ground with iron spades, mothers tending plots of barley and cabbage, children chasing off crows and hares that could strip a patch of seedlings overnight. If the crops failed, and they often did, the sea was their second harvest. Fathers and sons rowed low ships across frigid inlets, casting nets for cod and herring. Boys as young as 7 bailed icy water from the hull with their bare hands, squatting beside older men whose faces were cracked by salt and wind. If they fell overboard, the cold could snatch breath and life in minutes. Survival was not luck, it was skill, vigilance, and the stubborn refusal to yield. Yet beyond the fields and shorelines lay deeper challenges. Wolves prowled the outer forests, lean and watchful when the hunger months came. Bears stirred in the dusk near berry thickets. Even the rivers that brought life with their fish and water could turn treacherous in spring thaw, flooding fields and sweeping away unwary children. So the land itself became the first and most ruthless teacher. It did not offer warmth freely, it demanded sweat. It did not shelter weakness, it devoured the idle and the careless. In such a world, there was no room for softness. A child who wished to see manhood learned quickly that hardship was not a punishment, it was a forge. These lessons seeped into every breath. A boy or girl who fetched water from a frozen stream felt the sting of ice on skin that could blister and break. A child tasked with guarding sheep on a stormy hilltop learned to read the sky, the wind, the slightest change in scent that might signal a wolf's approach. Each task was a test, but also a promise. Endure this, and you will endure all. Many did not endure. The cold took its share. Disease, 2 fevers that had no name, wounds that festered. Viking parents buried children beneath stone cairns on windswept hills, placing carved amulets in their tiny hands, not out of sentiment alone, but out of the grim knowledge that the world owed no guarantee of tomorrow. To survive childhood was to prove oneself worthy of the life yet to come. Modern soldiers, wrapped in thermal gear and rationed calories, speak of training in frozen forests as a trial of will. For the Viking child, such forests were not a trial, but home. The frostbitten stream, the starving winter, the wolves that circled the pasture, these were as familiar as hearth smoke and mother's voice. A Norse proverb whispered from father to son, "Only iron can break iron." The land made them iron first, long before the blacksmith's hammer or the blade's edge could do so. And so the children of the north stepped out into the storm, spine straight, breath misting in the hard, endless dark forged by the harshest mother the world could offer, their own homeland. Long before a Viking child could walk, run, or lift an axe, life demanded their first proof of toughness. Birth itself a raw negotiation with death, in a world where survival was never certain. In the cramped dark of a turf-roofed longhouse, a woman laboured on a bed of straw and furs. There was no sterile chamber, no iron instruments polished by modern hands, only the flicker of firelight and the sharp scent of pine tar that sealed the drafty timbers. The midwife's hands were strong and rough from years of gutting fish and stripping hides. Her tools, bone needles, scraps of linen, a blade for the cord, and iron faith in the gods. When a child was born, the North watched with cold eyes. Many did not come screaming into the world at all breech births, tangled cords, a mother's body too frail from long winters of hunger. When the child did emerge, red and slick with the heat of life, the trial was far from over. Some fathers waited in silence, watching as the midwife placed the tiny body at the mother's breast, and if the babe did not draw breath, the mother's grief was brief and hidden. The child was returned to the earth, unnamed, a spark snuffed before the winds of the fjord could even taste it. Yet for those who took their first breath, the next test came quickly. The cradle was no padded cot. It was a rough, woven basket lined with sheepskin. Winters came hard gales that rattled doors like fists, frost that crept through stone floors. Newborns learned the cold on their skin. A tale survives of old women who rubbed their grandchildren with snow to awaken their strength, a belief that cold tempered the body, toughened the blood. In the smoke-hazed gloom of the longhouse, families slept side by side. Children nestled against parents, older siblings pressed close. This warmth was not a luxury. It was the thin shield that stood between breath and stillness. And still, sickness lurked in the corners. Croup, fever, the invisible killers that swept through families like raiders in the night. Some mothers carved small runes on wooden cradles, Thor's hammer for protection, Freya's blessing for fertile health, but even the gods were fickle in such matters. Those who lived were baptized not in holy water, but in frost and hunger. A father might press a cold iron blade to a baby's cheek, a symbolic first taste of steel. Some sagas hint at the exposure of weak or sickly newborns, carried to the forest's edge and left to the will of nature and spirits. This was no cruelty for its own sake. It was the grim calculus of a people whose survival hinged on the strength of each member, even the smallest. Modern birth is softened by warm wards, bright lamps, antiseptic touch. Life comes wrapped in blankets, guarded by machines that measure heartbeats and breath. But for the first Viking children, the only measure was the warmth of their own pulse against the biting wind outside. In the north, birth was not a gentle welcome, it was the first proving ground. A mother's lullaby might calm the night, but the land outside spoke louder. Only the strong stay. The rest returned to the dark. And so the seed of toughness was sown before a child ever stepped barefoot into snow. They were born into struggle, and if they could not endure it, the world took them back. Beyond the doorway of the longhouse, the winter night pressed close, a silent predator whose claws scratched at the timber walls and slipped icy fingers through every chink in the rough-hewn planks. Inside, the hearth fire glowed like a single red eye, its warmth a fragile barrier between breath and oblivion. For the youngest among the Norse, those first winters were more than cold, they were an unspoken test, waged in the cradle. A baby wrapped in wool and fur lay beside its mother on a raised sleeping platform, the smoke of the hearth rising in lazy threads overhead. Each breath was a small defiance against the night. Modern children enter a world swaddled in warmth, swaddled in layers of care. The Viking infant was swaddled too, but also hardened in ways that would stun modern parents. It was not uncommon for mothers to rub their babies' limbs with snow, believing this built a resistance to frost and illness. Old midwives taught that the cold shocked life into the flesh, braced the spirit, and toughened the bone. No gentle cradle song could silence the howl of wind beyond the door. The longhouse was not insulated by panes of glass and brick, but by turf and planks chinked with moss. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of smoke, damp wool, unwashed bodies, and the acrid tang of animals penned close to the walls for warmth. Sheep and goats lay near the fire, their breath mingling with that of the family, a shared warmth, a fragile pact against the endless night. When the fire burned low, it was the older children who rose at dawn's first grey hint to gather kindling and feed the embers. Babies cried, and mothers hushed them with milk or warm mead thickened with herbs. A crude comfort against the chill that crept under fur blankets when the wind howled hardest. Yet sickness came on the wind's back. Winter coughs, fever, the slow death of lungs that failed to draw enough life from the smoky air. There were no healers in white coats, only women with knowledge of roots and poultices, charms whispered in the flickering dark. Some babies survived, many did not. Tiny graves dotted the frozen earth behind farmsteads, marked with simple stones, or not at all. But for those who made it through that first unkind season, each breath was victory. It was in these nights that Viking parents learned to prize the strong. A baby that survived its first winter would likely see the next and the next beyond. The child who coughed but did not weaken, who shivered but did not fade, this was a child destined to stand firm against storms, iron blades, and fate itself. No modern boot camp teaches this kind of resolve. No camouflage uniform or survival drill can mimic the nightly test of living where the hearth must be fed or the cold claims its due. Each dawn was a reaffirmation. The child lives, the family endures, and the North gives its grudging blessing for one day more. So the Viking child learned resilience in the cradle. Before first words, before first steps, before a father's hand taught sword grip and spear throw, they knew the taste of hardship. They were not born into softness, but pressed against the whetstone of nature itself. In the depth of winter's black belly, the Norse mother sang softly to her child. Beyond the walls, wolves howled over snowdrifts tall as a man's shoulder. And in the cradle, the child slept, warmed by breath, tested by frost, made harder by a night that never truly slept. By the time the Viking child could stand firm on wobbly legs, the world no longer saw them as merely a child, but as another set of hands to wrestle life from an unforgiving land. Imagine dawn over a Norse farmstead. Thin grey light creeping through a mist of sea spray and frost. In the courtyard, goats bleat and stamp their hooves, waiting for hay or a turn to be milked. Chickens scatter underfoot, frost rims every fence post, and there, in the half-light, a child no older than 6 trudges through the yard, feet wrapped in scraps of wool bound with twine. This is Astrid, daughter of a fisherman. At an age when modern children still clutch stuffed toys and dream of warm kitchens, Astrid carries a wooden bucket half her height to the well. Her fingers crack in the cold. Her boots leak meltwater that freezes her toes numb by the time she returns. When the fire crackles to life, it is partly her work fetching the peat, tending the kindling, blowing sparks into flame when the men are gone to sea. Every child worked. There was no notion of idle youth, no schooling in the modern sense, no idle hours spent in soft chairs. Work was education. Bjorn, Astrid's cousin, might be up on the ridge at sunrise, a small figure among shaggy sheep, a slingshot in hand to keep hungry wolves at bay. He watches the sky for sudden storms, the snow for fox tracks, his breath fogging in the cold, while he scans the far tree line for shadows that move where no shadows should. These small tasks built habits that no adult command could teach. Responsibility rooted itself into the child's spine like iron. A lost sheep could mean lost wool, lost milk, lost life. Fire untended could mean cold death by dawn. A forgotten tool left out could rust overnight, wasting precious iron that a whole village depended on. Girls and boys alike gathered berries, stripped bark for kindling, dug roots in half-frozen soil, carried water, watched fences for gaps. In coastal villages, children stood barefoot on cold planks, gutting fish alongside their mothers, tiny fingers numb and red, learning to twist a blade just so to peel meat from bone. Every scrap was precious. Every task done well meant one less mouth gnawed by hunger when winter roared back from the north. But these labours were not burdens alone. They were the forge of the mind as well as the flesh. They taught vigilance, a slip of focus, and the fire died. They taught precision. Waste too much fat from a seal, and your family went hungry. They taught resilience. Small hands blistered, cracked, healed, and worked again the next dawn. Modern soldiers learned discipline on parade grounds, carrying rifles under the barked orders of sergeants. Viking children learned it in frostbitten fields and smoke-dark longhouses under the quiet orders of necessity and wind. Yet, in the evenings, after work and chores, there was warmth too. Family gathered around the hearth, stew bubbling in the iron pot, the old ones spinning sagas of gods and heroes. The children's hands worked still mending nets, braiding cord, twisting wool into yarn, but their minds danced among tales of Thor and Freya and the forefathers who braved worse storms than any that rattled their wooden door. So the child's daily work was never just toil. It was an apprenticeship in life's cold truths that warmth is earned, safety is fleeting, and only hands calloused by labour can hold a sword steady when the time comes to defend the home that labour built. By 7 or 8, a Viking child was no mere child. They were an apprentice survivor, an unsung recruit in the oldest army of all, the clan that could endure the North's merciless trial and hold its ground for another winter's siege. In the shadowed hush of the longhouse, where smoke curled above the central hearth and carved beams whispered the weight of generations, pain was not an accident to be soothed away. It was a tutor, ancient and merciless, that every Viking child knew by name. A child's scraped knee on frozen ground was not fussed over with warm compresses and whispered comfort. Instead, a father might nod once, seeing blood bead on pale skin, and say, "Good, now you know to watch your footing." Pain was not a thing to be fled from. It was a lesson etched in flesh. Discipline, too, was physical. A boy careless enough to lose a fishing hook or drop a knife into the hearth's embers might feel the sharp sting of a father's open palm or a switch cut from birch. It was not cruelty for its own sake, but memory carved into skin, an oath that next time he would hold tighter, watch sharper. For in the north, small mistakes could ripple outward, turning to hunger, cold, and death that stalked a whole household. Girls were not spared this hard teaching. A daughter who spilled precious oil while tending the hearth, who let embers die while the family slept, learned quickly what a slap across cold cheeks felt like, and learned just as swiftly to rise in the night, to check the fire, wrap fur around embers, shield warmth as if it were a newborn lamb. Yet, punishment was only part of this dance with pain. The other half was chosen freely, invited in like a guest who tested one's worth. Children wrestled in muddy yards until knees bled and lips split on teeth. Brothers fought with fists and sticks until an elder pulled them apart, often only when it was clear who was stronger, quicker, more stubborn. There was honour in bruises. A tooth knocked loose was cause for laughter, not lament. At the village games that filled brief summer dusk with shouts and laughter, young boys tested each other in stone-throwing contests, A heavy rock lifted from the riverbank, hurled far across wet sand, and a boy who failed to lift it heard the jeers of his age-mates ringing in his ears. No trophy for participation here. Pain and shame were the same forge they burned weakness out, left steel in its place. And when a child's body failed, the mind learned to endure in its place. An old tale from the Orkney Isles speaks of a boy named Sigurd, no more than 9, who stepped on an iron fishhook buried in snow. The barbed point pierced deep into his foot. The village smith dug it out with a dull blade beside the hearth, while Sigurd's mother held him by the shoulders. His screams echoed off the rafters, then faded. When it was done, the boy limped outside to show his friends the wound proof that he had not fainted, that he had watched steel bite his own flesh and live. Modern armies cultivate pain carefully, dosing it out in obstacle courses, cold marches, punishing drills. But for the Viking child, pain was woven through the warp and weft of daily life. It taught that the body was clay, to be hardened, not coddled. It taught that the mind could rule the body a truth more valuable than any sword. A child who learned to accept pain as part of the world grew into an adult who could stand in a shield wall, feel iron slice skin and muscle, yet hold the line. Such a man did not flinch when cold rain soaked his wounds, or when an enemy's axe roared down through the roar of battle. For the Viking, pain was an old friend by then, and an old friend could never break him. Where a modern child's playground might hold slides and swings, the Viking child's playground was a clearing at the edge of the forest ringed by rough pines, under a sky that shifted from blue to iron grey in moments. Here, laughter mingled with shouts of pain and the snap of sticks striking flesh. To the Norse, play was not an escape from life's hardships, it was a rehearsal for them. Watch a circle of boys and girls at dusk, barefoot on moss and cold stones, their tunics patched and knees scabbed from falls on frozen earth. They stand opposite each other, branches shaved smooth and swung like swords. What starts as mimicry of their father's shield walls soon becomes something harder, a clash of sticks and wills, grunts of effort, bruises blooming purple and green beneath wool sleeves. A father might stand at the edge of the clearing, arms crossed over a broad chest. If one child wept at a welt or a split lip, he did not rush in with soothing words. Instead, he called, "Up!" again. For the battlefield was not forgiving, and neither was childhood. A child who learnt to fall learned also to rise faster, stronger, less afraid of pain each time. Girls joined these games as often as boys. In the sagas, shield maidens like Brynhild and Lagertha loom large, but their spirit came from ordinary daughters who learned young that the farm or fjord could be a battleground too. Wrestling was common, a tangle of limbs and laughter in the muddy yard beside the longhouse. Whoever could throw an opponent onto their back 3 times was champion for a day, a small, fierce taste of glory that echoed the sagas their fathers recited by the hearth at night. Sometimes the games grew darker. Older boys made mock shields from driftwood, lashing hides over round frames. They formed tight circles and pressed against each other, shouting war cries. One would break rank, charging with a spear of pine, testing the wall's strength. The crack of wood against wood, the thud of a boy landing hard in the snow, these were lessons etched deep before any real battle was ever seen. In the coastal villages, boys threw stones at floating logs to sharpen their aim for future raids. When a spear must strike true, or a rock launched from a ship's rail must find an enemy's skull in the chaos of a boarding clash. The sea, the forest, the yard behind the longhouse, all were training grounds, rough and immediate, free of soft boundaries or careful oversight. In these games, a boy learned how a friend might become a rival, how anger must be mastered, how fear could be turned aside with a laugh and a renewed grip on a stick that tomorrow would be an axe. The older children taught the younger without words. A swing too high, a shove too rough, and the group made its own corrections. Respect was won by endurance and cunning, not by complaint. Modern soldiers practice with rubber knives and padded gear. They train in classrooms and obstacle courses built under electric lights. But the Viking child's drill yard had no barriers, no protection, but skin and grit. Every cut and bruise was a line in the first chapters of a warrior's saga, written not with ink, but with blood and bark and frozen earth. When dusk turned to full dark, the games ended, not with whistles or calls from mothers, but when breath steamed heavy in the cold, and limbs could carry no more. Then they trudged home together, through drifting snow, bruises throbbing, eyes bright, laughter echoing in the forest gloom. In each small wound they carried a lesson. One day soon they would stand not with sticks and soft shields, but steel and hide and iron will, because the game was never just a game. It was the forge of the North, shaping children into the kind of soldiers modern armies still struggle to make. Before a Viking child could read a rune or carve their own name into a piece of driftwood, they often knew how to hold a blade, and more importantly, how to wield it when words failed. Picture a boy named Knut, just 8 winters old. In the half-light of a summer morning, he kneels beside his father behind the longhouse, both of them silent as the old man unrolls a piece of oiled cloth. Inside lies a short sea-axe knife, its iron blade notched with years of sharpening. For Knut, this is more than a tool. It is an inheritance, a promise that one day he will guard the family's goats, the family's fields, the family's life. His father shows him how to hold it, not too tight to shake, not too loose to slip. He demonstrates how to clean fish with the careful flick of a blade, how to slice tough sinew, how to keep the edge from rusting in the salt-heavy air. But these are only lessons in passing. The deeper lesson lies unspoken in the father's eyes. Steel is life. Steel is the line between hunger and plenty, friend and foe. Boys as young as 6 swung sticks in imitation of their father's swords, but by 10 or 12, many held real weapons, small axes balanced for a boy's arm, knives tucked into belts, sometimes even a light spear taller than their own bodies. These were not ceremonial trinkets, but daily tools. A knife gutted fish by the fjord at dawn, but might also ward off a wolf's snap at dusk. While modern soldiers are handed rifles after weeks of drill, the Viking child's drill was life itself. The forests they roamed were home to predators 2 and 4-legged alike. Raiders came not just from across the sea, but from the next valley, the rival clan, the outlaw seeking an easy target on a lonely trail. Even a child knew that to be caught empty-handed was to be meat for someone braver or more desperate. Fathers taught sons in the same way grandfathers had taught them. They showed how to hold a small round shield made from hide stretched over planks. They showed where to place feet so an axe swing would not leave the chest exposed. In hidden clearings, older boys practiced throwing short spears at straw targets fixed to tree trunks. The targets were sometimes shaped like men's rough outlines to remind the arm and the eye what flesh felt like when struck. Girls, too, learned the blade's truth. A woman might be alone for days when her father, husband, or brother sailed to raid or fish. A mother taught her daughter where to stab if an intruder slipped past the door latch at night. Some girls learned to wield small axes for chopping wood, the same axes they might grasp by instinct if danger came with a knock at the door. This readiness was not paranoia, but simple sense. In the north, safety was as fleeting as sunlight in winter. The same blade that cleaned a rabbit could keep that rabbit from being stolen by a starving stranger when hunger gnawed deepest in the lean months. Children carved runes with knives before they carved them in stone. They inscribed simple charms on wooden toys, on fishing rods, on the handles of everyday tools. Each cut into wood or bone taught control, the same control they would need when gripping a sea axe in their fist. Pulse pounding, wind roaring in their ears. Modern armies spend weeks teaching recruits how to dismantle a rifle, how to feel its weight, how to stand when the shooting starts. For the Viking child, there was no such classroom. The forest was the class, the wind was the test, the blade was the final word. Long before the sagas named heroes who split shield walls and carved kingdoms from foreign shores, they named children who knew that in the end, steel would speak louder than any tongue, and that those who gripped it first gripped life itself. Inside the timbered belly of a Viking longhouse, under beams darkened by years of hearth smoke, the seeds of toughness did not sprout in solitude. They grew in the warmth and hardship of the clan. For a Viking child, life was never a private affair. It was communal, close, and binding like the timbers overhead, each plank relying on the others to hold fast against wind and snow. At night, families crowded together on raised sleeping platforms that lined the walls. Straw and sheepskins formed crude bedding, pelts layered on top to trap warmth. Children did not drift off alone in soft beds behind closed doors. They fell asleep, pressed shoulder to shoulder brothers, sisters, cousins, fosterkin, listening to the wind batter, the turf walls, the restless bleating of goats kept inside for warmth, the soft snores of a grandfather whose stories lingered like coals in the mind. It was here that a child first learned to guard not just themselves, but the whole. In winter, when the hearth embers burned low, older children would wake in the darkness to feed it, shoving logs into the glowing core so the youngest would not freeze. A careless watch could mean a cough turned to fever, a baby grown cold before dawn's pale eye opened above the fjord. Here too, discipline and loyalty rooted deep. Quarrels flared brothers elbowing for the warmest place near the fire, sisters pulling hair over whispered insults. But grudges did not live long in a house where the cold punished division. If a boy angered his cousin by hoarding furs at night, he might find himself shivering at the edge of the platform the next. The lesson was plain. Strength was shared or lost altogether. In this closeness, children learned secrets that no drill sergeant could bark into reluctant ears. They learned how to watch a brother's eyes for fear or shame. They learned when silence was safer than pride. They learned to rise together when the call came, a father's gruff voice at dawn, a mother's warning of wolves near the sheep pen, a sudden knock on the door when strangers arrived at the farmstead in the snow. This brotherhood and sisterhood was not mere sentiment. It was survival made flesh. It forged bonds stronger than iron. A boy who had kept his baby sister warm with the weight of his own body at 7 would stand a shield's breadth away from her at 17 when raiders landed on the fjord shore and the call to arms swept through the village. Modern soldiers speak of unit cohesion, of the trust that forms in barracks or muddy foxholes under enemy fire. But for Viking children, that bond was there long before the first blow landed. It was whispered in half-sleep, shaped by the weight of shared furs, by the hush of breath in cold darkness. Even the tales spun by firelight taught this truth. The sagas did not exalt the lone hero so much as they honoured the ring of shields, the band of brothers whose unity turned raw courage into victory. A child lying on straw listened to these stories, feeling the press of a sibling's foot against their back, the closeness of kin in every heartbeat. They knew, when cold or foe came howling at the door, no one stood alone. In this way, the longhouse was both cradle and crucible, a shelter that demanded its young learn not just to endure, but to endure together, to share warmth, to guard the flame. To trust that the same hands that stole the last scrap of smoked fish tonight might tomorrow be the only hands that hold the line beside you when the wolves come through the snow. There was a saying among the old ones in the far north: winter is not an enemy, it is the judge. For the Viking child, that truth was learned not in books, but in the hollow echo of an empty belly during the long dark months when the world itself seemed to sleep under snow. No matter how full the storehouse looked in autumn, hunger lurked behind every storm. The salted fish, the dried lamb, the barrels of pickled root all vanished quicker than hope when blizzards piled waist-high at the longhouse door. And when the wind rattled the turf roof and snowdrifts buried the barns, children learned that survival was not guaranteed by the bounty of summer, but by their own wits and endurance. A boy like Asger, 10 winters old, might be shaken awake before dawn by his father's hand, the older man's breath fogging in the frozen air inside the longhouse. Together, they would trudge into the pre-dawn dark to check the pit traps near the tree line, hoping a hare or fox had blundered into the snares during the night. A single rabbit meant meat in the pot and fur for mending mittens. Girls like Yrsa, just 12, learned to dig through frozen earth with bare hands to free the last of the turnips hidden in straw-lined pits beneath the snow. When frost cracked the barrels in the pantry and mould threatened salted fish, the children's quick eyes and quicker hands saved what they could. There was no waste. There could be none. When spring was slow to come, when storms dragged past their time, the hunger months tightened their grip. Families thinned the gruel with snowmelt, stretched smoked meats with foraged bark and bitter wild greens. Children chewed tough, stringy roots, scraping at frozen patches in the woods for anything that might quiet the ache inside. Yet the hunger was more than hardship. It was a silent teacher. It taught patience when there was none left to find. It taught children how to endure discomfort without complaint, how to savour a scrap of dried fish as if it were a feast. It taught them that warmth and food were not rights, but trophies, won by sharp eyes, quick feet, and calloused hands. Modern recruits learn ration discipline under strict rules, counting calories, testing willpower in controlled hunger. The Viking child knew no such controlled trial. The hunger was real, the cold was real, and the penalty for failure was not extra drill, but a grave dug shallow in frozen ground behind the longhouse. Yet from this shared scarcity grew something harder than bone, gratitude, and grit. When spring finally cracked winter's spine and snowdrifts gave way to green shoots, the children did not run from memory of the hunger months they carried it within them. A cold ember that would flare to life each time life demanded more than comfort could offer. When that same child, grown into a youth with spear in hand, waded ashore on a Saxon coast, or stood shivering in a birch grove, waiting for an enemy shield wall to break, the memory of that hollow belly burned brighter than fear. Hunger had taught him that the body can bend without breaking, that the will can outlast the worst the world could offer. In the north, winter's gnawing mouth-shaped children into stone beneath the skin stones that armies of polished steel would struggle to grind down centuries later. The north was no gentle mother. It wrapped its children in darkness and ice, forced them to stand barefoot in snow before they could spell their own names. To live was to bow to the cold and to rise hardened from its embrace. The modern mind imagines warmth as a right. For the Viking child, warmth was earned, never guaranteed. It was the hearth fire fed before dawn, the sheepskin cloak stitched by a mother's cracked hands, the body heat shared with siblings on straw beds, lined against a timber wall that creaked when the wind howled like Fenrir's jaws. Winter was not simply endured, it was studied. A boy like Rurik, 12 winters old, learned how to wrap moss inside his boots to stop frostbite from claiming his toes during long days, watching sheep on snow-choked hills. A girl like Freydis might stand waist-deep in a frozen river, washing skins or dragging nets beneath the ice, while her breath curled in silver ghosts above black water. The cold taught children limits and how to stretch them. There were no padded coats or fleece-lined mittens, no flasks of hot broth tucked into school bags. Instead there was wool, fur, and skin, all worn thin by constant use, repaired again and again by deft fingers in the flickering dark. To lose a mitten was to lose fingers. So, children learned not to lose anything. Not tools, not warmth, not time. Rituals hardened the spirit as well as the flesh. Boys dared each other to plunge bare arms into icy streams at midwinter, gritting their teeth while snowflakes fell on steaming skin. Fathers sometimes ordered sons to sleep a night outside the walls, wrapped in nothing but a cloak, and their own resolve a test of endurance, whispered through generations. If you can face the cold alone, you can face anything. Modern soldiers drill in snow for weeks to learn what it means to be cold, to let frost bite the ears, to feel toes turn to dull stone inside boots. But for the Viking child, the cold was not an exercise. It was the backdrop of life. Fetching water from a frozen creek at dawn, hacking at ice to reach the fish below, hauling buckets so heavy they split small palms until the blood froze on the handles. This was daily practice for survival. And from that practice rose something no drill sergeant could impose. A quiet defiance. The child who learnt to laugh when the wind cut like knives, who sang under breath while crossing fields crusted with snow so deep the family's fence posts vanished. Beneath it, that child grew into an adult who did not flinch when storms came, or blades, or hunger. They knew already, the cold breaks the weak and tests the worthy. If you could outlast the blizzard, you could outlast anything, even the clash of steel on a far Saxon shore, even the bitter shriek of arrows overhead. In the north, frost did not kill the Viking child's spirit, it tempered it, like iron plunged, hissing into a snowbank. Harder, sharper, ready for a world that would never grow warm. Long after the cold had numbed young fingers, when chores were done and darkness pressed against the longhouse walls, Viking children found another forge for their toughness, not of frost or labour, but of words and memory. In the hush of a winter night, the family gathered tight around the hearth where embers glowed and smoke curled into the rafters. The youngest curled in furs, faces lit by the flicker of the flames. And there sat the oldest, the grandmother with hair like drifted snow, the grandfather whose back stooped but whose eyes burned bright as any youth's. They spoke of the old ways, tales not to entertain idle minds, but to carve iron into the soul. The sagas they told were not bedtime comforts, but living maps of courage, cunning, and resolve. A child might hear of Sigurd, who slew the dragon Fafnir, and licked its heart-blood from his thumb, gaining the tongue to speak with birds. Or Herva, the warrior maiden who dared to raise her father's ghost from a burial mound to demand his cursed blade. These were not fairy tales, they were warnings, promises, calls to stand unflinching before fear. Every hero faced pain, darkness, loss. Every hero rose again, blade or wit or will, sharpened by ordeal. A boy like Eric sat cross-legged near the hearth, eyes wide as his grandfather rasped out verses of the Havamal, Odin's own wisdom for living and dying well. Cattle die, kinsmen die, you too shall die. But one thing never dies, the fame of the brave. What child could listen to those words and not taste flint behind their teeth? What softness could grow in a mind fed on the idea that life's only sure promise was hardship, and that the only true failure was cowardice in the face of it? These lessons did not vanish at dawn. When a boy rose in the morning to wade through snow to check traps, he did not do so only for meat. He did so with the memory that his father's father had done the same, and that strength was a chain unbroken by storms or centuries. When a girl drew water through ice so thick it split the bucket's rim, she bore the same patience as the shield maidens whose tales her mother whispered in the hush between chores. In this way, the elders did more than guard the past. They armed the future, forging a child's spine in words older than runes carved in stone. They taught that the flesh would fail before the will must bend, that to be tough was not to be heartless, but to stand unbowed when life struck its hardest blow. When the last ember hissed to ash, and the children drifted to sleep on straw beds warmed by body heat alone, the wisdom of the elders stayed with them, an unseen armour beneath thin wool and scraped skin. Modern soldiers memorize codes of conduct, creeds barked in training yards. The Viking child carried theirs in the marrow of their bones, verses older than any general's oath, stories whispered in firelight, reminding them that when the world turned cruel, it did not do so to break them, but to prove they could not be broken. If pain and hunger forged the Viking child's body, and stories tempered their mind, then the first true crossing from childhood into something harder came with blood and the silent oaths that bound it. In the sagas, a boy's first hunt is spoken of with weight equal to his father's first raid. To spill blood was to step across an invisible threshold to prove that one's hands could do what the cold and the wolves demanded. Picture Svein, 12 winters behind him, the last few days of early spring, heavy with thaw and promise. The forest drips with meltwater. Tracks cross the slush hare, fox, and once the broad, heavy mark of a wild boar's passage through old snow. Beside him walks his uncle, axe slung across his back, eyes sharp beneath a battered hood. No words pass between them. Words are for the hearth. Out here, only steel and silence matter. When Svein's spear first pierces fur and bone, his breath seizes in his chest. The hare screams a thin, awful cry, swallowed by the still pines, and in that sound, Svein knows for the first time what it is to take life so that his own may endure. There is no celebration, no soft praise. Only the uncle's hand on his shoulder, heavy as an anvil, and the quiet nod, "You've done what you must, remember that." Among some families, older boys carved shallow cuts into their forearms on the eve of their first hunt, or rayed thin lines, inked later with ash or soot, small black scars like runes under the skin. A mark that spoke for life. I did not flinch when iron bit flesh neither my praise nor my own. These were not savage displays. They were the ritual language of a people who understood that courage, once proven, demanded witness. To spill blood and keep one's hands steady was to promise the clan that when worse days came, when strangers hammered shields on the fjord shore, or hunger pushed neighbours to blades, that child, now half grown, would not turn away. Oaths too were woven into these first crossings. Boys and girls alike swore simple words by the fire, or beside the burial mounds where ancestors lay. A boy might press a palm to the cold mound stones and promise to stand by his brothers when the ship's prow cleaved foreign waves. A girl, knife in hand, might vow never to let her mother's hearth die to darkness or neglect. Modern soldiers swear allegiance with flags and formal creeds, voices raised in echoing halls. The Viking child's oath was simpler, whispered under breath, cut into skin, sealed by the red truth of a life taken or a wound borne willingly. Even the youngest knew that blood given or spilled was the oldest bond of all. It spoke a language older than runes, clearer than any law. Once you had tasted that copper tang in your mouth, or watched it steam on the snow beneath a fresh kill, you could never again pretend the world was soft. And so they stepped forward, boys, with spears too tall for their shoulders, girls with knives hidden beneath their cloaks, marked by their first blood, bound by unspoken vows. Small warriors in a world that would test whether those shallow cuts and whispered oaths could stand firm when the true storms came. In the dim corners of the longhouse, where stories often tell only of sons forging axes and fathers raising spears, a quieter truth burns just as fiercely. Viking girls were forged in the same cold fire, tempered by the same winds, and hardened by trials that demanded no less steel than the path walked by their brothers. Take Thora, 12 winters old. At dawn she rises before the cockerel crows, slipping from her furs, while frost still rims her breath. Her father and brothers are gone to sea for the early spring catch, so the weight of the homestead falls on her slim shoulders and her mother's weary hands. She hauls water from the creek, arms raw where rope scrapes flesh through thin wool sleeves. She drives stubborn goats from the dark of the byre out to winter-burned pasture. She chops kindling, standing barefoot on frozen mud, because the family's only boots are lashed to her brother's feet far out on the sea. Where a boy learns to swing a sword by sparring in the yard, Thora learns to wield her axe by splitting logs that resist every strike. She knows how to gut a fish as deftly as any man, how to skin a rabbit without wasting the precious fur that will line her baby sister's winter shoes. But her toughness does not stop at the door. When storms batter the fjord and raiders sail close enough for rumours to flicker through the village, it is the women who stand watch by the thresholds. Knives hidden in skirts, eyes sharp for shadows. The sagas remember, the shield maidens who fought beside men on distant shores, but they rarely sing of women like Thora, who learned to grip a blade, not for glory, but for survival. A mother's hands are never soft in the north. She weaves rough wool with fingers scarred by knives and needles. She lifts steaming cauldrons from the hearth, with wrists thickened by endless labour. She teaches her daughters how to heal wounds with poultices of moss and honey, and how to make new wounds if danger comes uninvited in the night. For girls, toughness meant more than endurance of cold and hunger. It meant braving childbirth that killed more women than any battle took men. It meant binding wounds by the glow of an oil lamp when the men returned from raids bloodied and broken. It meant carrying a baby on the hip while gutting a seal caught in an ice hole at dusk. A Viking girl's play was not dolls in a cradle, but wooden knives, whittled from driftwood, or small hammers lifted from the smithy bench when the blacksmith turned his back. The stories whispered by mothers were not all of gods and heroes, but of Freydis, who split skulls with an axe on Vinland's wild shores when men fled. Of Herva, who called her dead father's spirit from the grave mound to claim his cursed blade. Of ordinary women who fought not always with steel, but with spine. Modern soldiers speak of battle-hardened men, but in the north, the hearth was as much a battlefield as any rain-swept coast. And Viking girls grew hard in that fire, born to feed the clan, defend it, raise sons and daughters as tough as stone, and, when fate demanded, stand with iron in their fists and a war cry on their lips. When the sun dipped behind the fjord's jagged teeth and the last light faded from the pine forests, the Viking child did not slip beneath blankets, trembling at the night's edge. Instead, they grew up inside the dark, learned its voice, its secrets, and its terrors, until they no longer flinched when shadows whispered just beyond the fire's glow. Night in the north was not the soft darkness of cities or the muted hush of a modern home's insulated walls. It was a vast, living thing, a black sea broken only by the pale shimmer of stars, and, in winter, the ghost fire of the northern lights flickering like the spirits of the dead across an ink sky. In this world, children kept watch. A boy like Orm, barely 10, might stand at the pen door in deep winter, a torch stub flickering in his numb hand, listening for the soft pad of a wolf's paw through the snowdrifts. If he slept, the goats were lost, and maybe the family with them. Fear was a luxury he could not afford. The sagas tell of children sent into the forest at dusk to fetch missing sheep or gather firewood. Alone, with only the muffled crunch of snow beneath their feet and the black branches of fir trees creaking overhead, they learned to hush the pulse that hammered in their throats, to walk slowly, silently, to trust eyes that adjusted to moonlight, to listen for the snap of a twig that might mean bear, wolf, or something older, something the stories claimed walked the forests when men slept. And the stories were many. Trolls lurking behind stones, the Draugr restless dead who rose from mounds to prowl the night, the Huldra, the forest woman with a fox's tail, who lured the careless child away forever. But these tales were not told to frighten children into weakness. They were warnings. Know the dark. Learn its rules. Walk through it without losing your mind. When the longhouse doors barred tight against the wind, the night still seeped in. Shadows flickered in corners beyond the hearth's reach. The wind's wail in the chimney might mask a footstep or a tapping at the wall. Children lay awake beside siblings, breathing the same stale warmth, staring into the rafters, listening. The fear they tasted there hardened them more than any iron or coal. They learned not to flinch at every creak, not to cower at every whisper. Modern soldiers know night as a test exercises in forests with night vision gear, silent marches under orders to conquer the fear of darkness. But the Viking child grew up where darkness was not an obstacle to defeat, but a fact of life, a cloak they learned to wear. In the darkness, the mind sharpens. A boy who can wait alone in the tree line for the fox that might slip into the henhouse can wait for an enemy's approach without shivering his resolve away. A girl who can rise in the pitch of a stormy night to check the thatch for leaks, or to quiet livestock restless at shadows, can stand watch on a lonely shore when strangers land at dawn. Fear of the dark is a modern child's nightmare. For the Viking child, the dark was a familiar, an old friend that offered no mercy but demanded courage. And the child who met the night's cold eyes without trembling carried that fearlessness forward into every raid, every hunt, every long black winter to come. What made a Viking child stand firm in the snow when lesser souls would break? What held their resolve when wolves circled or sails darkened the fjord? Part of the answer lay not in their hands or hearths, but in their minds, armoured by stories, rituals, and a faith that made fear itself seem small. To the Norse, the world was alive with forces that cared nothing for human weakness. Gods, giants, spirits, and shadows moved unseen in the forests and the seas. A child learned early that life was a bargain with powers greater than themselves, and that to fear death or pain was to waste what little breath the Norns had spun for them at birth. In the hush before dawn, a father might tie a small Thor's hammer amulet around his son's neck before the boy left to check traps deep in the snow-choked woods. Not a toy, but a promise. Thor watches. Thor lends you his strength. A mother whispered charms to ward off trolls before sending her daughter alone to gather wood at dusk. The words gave warmth against the chill that no cloak could block. Children watched elders mark doors with protective runes, trace charms on sleds and fishing nets, carve symbols into the hafts of knives, not superstition for its own sake, but a way of placing courage, like a shield, over the heart. If Odin's ravens flew overhead at dusk, it was a sign that knowledge and foresight walked with you through the dark. If thunder cracked across the hills, it was Thor's hammer-striking trolls that lurked just beyond mortal sight. When a child scraped a knee or split skin on stone, a grandmother might rub ash into the wound while humming a half-forgotten prayer to the old gods. The pain, mingled with whispered runes, taught the child that hurt could be mastered and that each drop of blood given up was seen by something greater, something that counted bravery as currency. Modern soldiers draw strength from mottos, flags, national anthems. The Viking child drew strength from a world where every tree might hide a spirit, every wind carry a god's breath. They did not fight only for themselves, but with an unseen host at their side. Death itself was not to be feared, but faced with open eyes. The sagas tell of men and women who laughed when the end came, certain they would rise from the smoke of the pyre to stand in Odin's hall. Children absorbed these tales like mother's milk. They learned that to cower was shameful, to face what must be faced was honour. And if the cold took them, or hunger, or iron, on a raid years hence, they would join a long line of kin waiting at the table in the next life, well-fed, well-armed, forever unbowed. So when the wind howled over the longhouse roof and the dark pressed its weight through the cracks, a Viking child did not pray for it to pass. They lay beneath furs, amulet at their throat, rune carved on the bedpost, and whispered to themselves what their fathers whispered before them. Pain is fleeting, fear is hollow, we do not break. It was not blind faith, but an unshakable armour of belief, a spiritual iron that braced the flesh and steadied the heart. And in that quiet promise, the smallest child learned to stand taller than storms, hunger, or sword. No Viking child reached adulthood without meeting death face to face, not only on distant raids or in tales spun by hearthlight, but in the small, bitter moments when sickness crept through the longhouse and carved away the weak. Modern children are sheltered from this truth. Hospitals hum with machines. Medicine wards off fevers that once emptied entire villages. But in the north, winter coughed death into every doorway, and children learned to stand beside it without flinching. Imagine Solveig, 8 years old, crouched beside her younger brother on a bed of straw and furs. His breath rattles in his chest, a cold that turned cruel when smoke from the hearth thickened the air for nights on end. Her mother dips linen rags in warm broth mixed with herbs, pressing them to his forehead, humming old charms to ease the fever's grip. Beside her, Solveig watches. She fetches water, wipes sweat from his brow, listens to the soft sob that slips from her mother's cracked lips when she thinks the child sleeps. Sometimes the sickness breaks, the child lives, the house exhales, but sometimes it does not. And so a girl like Solveig helps carry a small, stiff body wrapped in deerskin to a grave on the hill where the wind moans through the cairns of those who went before. No priests, no prayers in gilded halls, just stones stacked over frozen earth, a rune carved into a wooden marker, and the unspoken lesson driven deep into every child's heart. Life owes no mercy, only what you seize and hold. Where modern armies train soldiers to keep moving when comrades fall, the Viking child learned this discipline in the cradle. They saw mothers stagger under grief, only to rise and chop wood the same dusk to keep the rest alive. They watched fathers hammer planks to seal a grave, then mend a fishing net by lantern's glow because hunger waits for no morning. This closeness to death bred a steadiness that no battlefield alone could teach. A child who watched siblings laid beneath cold stones did not fear the spear or the edge of an axe later. They understood loss was part of the great weave that the Norns, those shadowy weavers of fate, clipped threads when and where they pleased. When a child fell sick themselves, there was no soft promise that pain would pass. There was only grit, the cough that split the ribs, the fever that stole breath, the raw throat, and cracked lips, each an unspoken bargain struck with the North. Survive, and you emerged tempered. Fail, and you fed the soil that gave life to kin who remained. In time, the boy who once wept at a sister's burial might row a longship through storms toward foreign shores. The girl who once packed snow around a fevered child's body to draw out the heat might stand at a door with a knife hidden beneath her apron when strangers came calling in winter's dusk. Modern soldiers wear medals for courage in the face of death. The Viking child wore no badge, only the quiet, hard knowledge that death walked the yard and the forest, the hearth and the sea. To live beside it without flinching that was toughness no uniform could teach. For the Viking child, the final test of their forged toughness came not in the longhouse or the frozen pasture, but at sea, on the prow of a longship, cutting through grey waves toward an enemy coast none of them had ever seen. By 12, 13, sometimes younger, a boy might find himself standing among hardened men whose beards were salted with the spray of 100 raids. His arms still soft from growth, but his hands calloused by rope and oar, his stomach tight with a mix of hunger and pride. Imagine Gear, 14 winters, standing barefoot on wet planks as salt spray stings his eyes. The sail bellies with wind overhead, thick wool treated with animal fat, flapping like the wings of Odin's ravens. Beside him, his uncle sharpens a sea axe on a whetstone, the rasp of iron steady against the roar of the sea. This is no training drill, no quiet night watch in the goat pen. This is the edge of the known world, where a boy's resolve either holds or breaks. In the tales sung over mead horns, the first raid is a promise sealed with salt and blood. A father's whisper at the shore, if you return a man. If you do not, you stand beside me when my own spear fails me one day. The longship beaches, in dawn's weak light, sand grates under boots and bare feet alike. The boy's spear weighs heavy in his palm, heavier than the axe he split firewood with, heavier than the stick he swung in the yard. The men move in a line, shields out, the low growl of the sea behind them. Some clutch torches, some smile through cracked lips, not for the fight itself, but for the wealth that waits behind the monastery walls or the farmstead door. Modern soldiers taste battle behind ranks of camouflage and steel, surrounded by roaring machines. But the Viking boy's first battle was raw and close breath and sweat and iron, no further than an arm's reach. The clash came fast, a door splintered by an axe, a shout in a tongue he did not yet know, the first wild flash of fear. Yet this fear was familiar, the same fear he had tasted when wolves circled sheep in the blizzard, when fever hollowed his brother's eyes, when the river ice cracked beneath his boots in spring melt. He did not shrink from it. He stepped into it. If he faltered, No sergeant barked him forward. If he stumbled, only the hard press of his uncle's palm on his back urged him on. And when the blood came his own or another's, it brought no surprise. The first cut across the forearm, the sting of it, no different than the fishing hook that once buried itself in his foot by the fjord. Pain, then numbness, then the clear ringing of thought. This is what I was forged for. And when it was done, when fire licked the thatch, when foreign gold filled calloused hands, when the boy stood shoulder to shoulder with warriors twice his age, he was no longer boy. He had crossed that final threshold, fear endured, steel drawn, blood tasted. Modern soldiers return home to medals, parades, and headlines. The Viking youth returned to the longhouse with a new scar, a share of silver, and the silent nod of a father who now knew his son could stand where storms break hardest. In this, the North's hardest children found their final shape, not only hardened by ice and hunger, but baptized by the same iron that made kings tremble on distant shores. In distant barracks under electric lights, modern soldiers push their bodies to the edge. Cold weather drills in frozen forests, obstacle courses that tear skin and muscle, forced marches through rain and snow. They crawl on elbows through mud, haul packs that crush shoulders raw, and speak of forging brotherhood in the field. They do it in weeks, months, under watchful eyes, with hot meals waiting when the exercise ends, with medics to patch the wounds that training brings. And make no mistake, they emerge hard, sharper than they entered, but they chase, in concentrated bursts, what the Viking child lived every day from cradle to grave. The modern soldier must be taught to welcome hunger, to feel the stomach clench for hours and still march. The Viking child learned hunger at the hearth, when the salted fish ran dry in the storm month, and the fire crackled low while the wind howled through the thatch. The modern soldier must be broken to discipline stripped of soft habits, their sense of self rebuilt by shouted orders and rigid ranks. The Viking child learned discipline by the soft murmur of a mother at dusk. If you do not guard the sheep tonight, we starve. No barked command, just the hard certainty of consequence. Camouflage and gear shield the modern recruit from the raw bite of the world. The Viking child wore wool that let the wind slip through, boots patched so many times they were more whole than hide. If frost came, they learned not to curse it, but to adapt to kneel by a stream and rub snow into limbs, to remind the flesh it must serve the will. Teamwork, in a modern force, is drilled with slogans and codes. The Viking child's bond was older forged in nights huddled shoulder to shoulder on straw beds, warmth traded like breath, the sure knowledge that when wolves circled the pasture, no single child stood alone. Modern warriors learn to trust their gear, to rely on supply lines humming thousands of miles away. The Norse youth trusted only his knife, his kin, and the gods whose names he carved into a driftwood stick before he slipped it into the seam of his tunic for luck. A recruit in uniform might spend his entire first battle hidden by gunpowder smoke, never seeing the enemy's eyes. A Viking boy saw everything the tremor in a raider's hand before an axe swung down, the flare of fear in a monk's wide stare as the longship scraped the shore. Blood sprayed not in cinematic distance, but across forearm, cheek, tunic. And through it all, the Norse child bore no illusion of rescue. No helicopters waiting to lift them from the line, no promise that technology would outmatch nature. The only armour was what they'd been given by the North, a back straightened by hardship, a will tempered in hunger, a mind taught to stand calm where weaker ones wept. This is not to diminish the modern soldier whose grit in frozen mud and foreign deserts is carved from the same human spirit, but the Viking child was not made in weeks or months. He or she was shaped for years, every dawn a lesson, every storm a test. What a drill, Sergeant demanded in training yards. The North demanded from the moment a child's first cry echoed beneath a smoke-stained roof. By the time they first lifted a sword in battle, they were already more than recruits. They were living proof that toughness is not donned like armour. It is grown inside the bone, fed by cold, hunger, and unyielding faith that weakness is a debt no soul can afford. Centuries have drifted like sea mist since the last Viking longship slipped across the North Sea's grey teeth. The old longhouses lie buried beneath farm fields and pine forests now. The sagas echo in books instead of hearths, but the spirit that made Viking children harder than iron has never wholly vanished. It lingers in the marrow of the North. In the winter-broken villages of Norway and Iceland, children still plunge bare arms into icy lakes for sport. Swimmers break through frozen rivers to greet the dawn, an echo of boys who once dove into fjords to prove to the gods they feared neither frost nor deep water. The stoic hush of a Scandinavian farmstead on a wind-battered coast still bears faint traces of the longhouse's old lessons. That warmth is a gift won by toil, that neighbours share not just stories but survival, that a door left unlatched can invite ruin when storms rise. Even in modern armies, the toughest recruits are those who carry within them the same quiet resilience. They come from hard ground and harder winters, from places where a child still learns, however softened by time, that cold is not an enemy but a measure of resolve. But for the rest of us, the ones who wake in warm beds, the ones who curse a cold shower, who flinch at hunger pangs, dulled by modern plenty, the Viking child's legacy asks a sharper question. What have we traded for our comfort? Their world was not gentle, but it was clear. You endured or you perished. You trusted your kin because your life might one day rest in their frostbitten hands. You saw pain not as injustice, but as the world's simple price for the right to stand another day. In an age where survival is no longer fought for hour by hour, where soldiers train toughness for weeks instead of living it from birth, the old lessons might yet whisper something worth remembering. Hardness is not cruelty. Discipline is not oppression. Fear-faced young is fear mastered for life. In the hush of night, beneath electric lights, instead of flickering hearths, we might ask ourselves if we could stand where a 12-year-old once stood barefoot in snow, spear in hand, steady as the iron sky, and if not, whether we could find within us the ancient spark that says, we are more than soft flesh, we are what cold and fire make of us, if we dare let them shape us. In this echo lives the truth that Viking children carried to distant shores, carved into runes, spoken in sagas, left in cairns of stone beneath the endless northern sky. Toughness is not trained. It is lived, forged in frost, tempered in hunger, bound in blood, and remembered in stories like this, so we never forget what true hardness looks like.